election cycle that was as contentious and divided as any we've seen, some have openly wondered about the path forward as a united nation. It was the subject of an op-ed written before the election by my next guest this morning, Republican activist Renee Plummer, and Democratic co-author John Broderick, former Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. Good to see you guys.
Hi.
Great to be here, Josh.
Quite a cycle, no question about that. It was historic and plenty of political theater. But when it came to the article you guys wrote before the election, I want to point it out.
Thank you.
Why did you decide to do it, Renee?
Just because of what just happened last night or last week, we're talking about people rioting, that my fear was that there's going to be riots in the streets. So John and I have co-chaired the New Hampshire No Labels, but we understand that there's a path to putting everybody together. You know, everybody has some sort of goals. And I think for me, I needed it to get out there before the election to tell people that we have to work together. I mean, I was really, really concerned about riots and the way people were going to see this election. And I want people to see two people that are completely opposite, but we have to have some goals that we can work forward and work towards. So. And
I did it because Renee told me how to do it. And I do what Renee tells me. No, Renee and I are in different political parties, but that's really not the point. The point is that both of us, and most Americans, Josh, we're not unique, are concerned about the future of the United States. And having watched Washington, it's dysfunctional. And at some point, it really matters that it's dysfunctional. We have so many challenges, both here and overseas. If we can't sit down as Americans and say, we need to solve this problem, we need to do it, we need to get about it, it's not going to be easy. And the language in politics these days demonizes people who disagree with you. I mean, Renee and I could disagree. It never becomes personal. And it seems to me those who have our public trust ought to be willing to step up to that bar and solve the nation's problems, or at least discuss them. And at some point, without being too dramatic about it, at some point, the challenges confronting this country will not be solved. And that's not in anyone's interest, R, D, or I. We need to fix it.
I have to imagine that when you wrote this article, again, it was before the election, it probably came with the assumption that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency. I mean, you can admit to that or not, but it's, I mean, who knows? I mean,
no, I mean, for me, it didn't matter. You know, did I think that the Republicans were going to not win the way we did win? But that didn't matter.
Sure.
It was like, John, you and I have to go ahead and be together. Because there are people that probably feel very much like we do, but they don't have the voice. I mean, to have the former Chief Justice sitting here and does this, I mean, and for me, I want to do this for people that are just so upset with what's going on, but they don't know where to go. They don't know where to channel this. So let us be the ones that are out there. I mean, I want everybody in the country to see this. Also, my biggest fear is that there are people in this world that want to hurt us. So the more that they see how weak America is, that they're loving this. I don't want them. I want us as citizens to make America strong. You know, I don't want us to be weak. I want us to be strong. So people, you know, read the article and go on the same path as we are. You don't need to go ahead and be physically, you know, you go into these riots and everything. I hate it. I just hate it. We need to sit down and have a conversation and work towards, you know, making things better.
Your Honor, same question for you, though. I mean, because language matters, as you said. You touched on that a moment ago. But when you wrote this article, maybe you were thinking that it was going to be a President Hillary Clinton.
Let me tell you something. Did I think Hillary Clinton would be president? I did. So was I shocked when she wasn't? I was. But as Renee said, I did not write it like it only applied if she won, or only applied if she didn't win. The challenge is the same. We've had a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. They can't agree on the shape of a table. Okay, we've got to change our attitude. One of the things, Josh, language is so important, and I'm old enough to remember elections past and what happened the day following. I don't remember this. Donald Trump is the president-elect of the United States. Would I have selected him? No. Does that matter much? No. What matters is that as Americans, we find common ground. And we need to stop, both parties, we need to stop insulting each other. We need to stop questioning motives. Joe Biden, when he decided a year ago not to run, and he spoke in the Rose Garden of the White House, he said something which was obvious but profound. He said, we need to find consensus in American life or it will be too late. And we've got to stop this righteous sense of, I'm right, you're wrong. You're the enemy, I'm the good guy. As long as that continues, we lose. The other thing I think people can be doing, and my son mentioned this to me this morning, he said, Dad, I think Americans don't have to wait for Washington to do everything. So some of the tension in our society, for example, is with various religious sects or racial sects. Why do we have to wait for Washington to solve that problem? Why don't we as Americans start extending the olive branch and change the discussion?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's how I feel. And don't forget, we put the people into Washington, so we can tell them what to do. Damn it!
But what kind of an example though does Washington set? Because I mean, maybe I'm being Pollyanna here. Maybe Donald Trump, because of the uncertainty around him, and there's a fear factor. Let's be honest, just because we've been told about his temperament, that maybe Republicans, Democrats who have been at gridlock and at odds for so long will be more willing to discuss things, to maybe create a bubble and work together to make sure that that this government is run properly.
He could. Obviously, I don't know Donald Trump. I only know what you know, what we've seen. And some of the bombast hasn't been helpful. But I don't know Donald Trump. If Donald Trump decided that he was going to represent all the people of the United States, he might find some legislative initiatives that include all the people without politics. For example, do we need infrastructure in America? Absolutely. Is there any politics in infrastructure? If there is, it's not obvious. There are a lot of Americans in our country who need job skills. They need job training and retraining. Is there any politics in that? I don't see it. If he started with issues where people could coalesce. On the other hand, if you start with divisive issues, it's not going to allow that to happen as naturally.
You both must be pleased, though, that he has recognized repeatedly here in New Hampshire the opioid crisis, something you both have been, and heroin crisis, crisis of addiction, something you both have been active in working on. That must please you.
Yes, but unfortunately, isn't that sad? That is bringing everybody together, yes. Is the opiate crisis. I mean, I wish it was something flowery. I wish that we didn't have to do this.
Sure.
But we have to. And yes, he understood that. He understood veterans' issues, so I was pleased about that. But it's just too bad that that's what brings us together. But if it's going to bring us together, then we're going to do it.
And so be it. We have less than a minute to go, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't get your take on this, sir. And that's obviously Donald Trump might be in position to appoint 3 justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. What are you hoping? What type of justice are you hoping for?
Well,
will you get a phone call?
Yeah, I'm not holding my breath. This is what I hope. And I spoke to you some time ago when Merrick Garland was being held up, which I thought was inappropriate. A different situation, different party. I said to you then, I say to you now, I want democracy to work as intended. So if Donald Trump nominates people, I may not like them, but that's not the acid test, is it? The question is, does the process give them a hearing and give them a vote? And I would say yes. And I hope we don't get back into that. I didn't choose them. I'm not giving you a hearing.
Well, we got to run. Let democracy work. And I really do appreciate the work that both of you guys have been doing. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Josh. Appreciate it.